speakers. Very pleased to have Ichiro Fukumori talk about causal mechanisms of sea level change in the Arctic Ocean, in the Beaufort Sea. So with that, I'll hand it over to Ichiro. So feel free to share your screen if you can.
Thank you, Wilbert. Let's see. I assume you can see a full screen of my talk. Okay, well, yes. So here we'll be exploring causal mechanisms of sea level change observed in the Beaufort Sea. O. Wang and Ian Fenty, who are also at JPL, are co-authors of this study described at the listed at the bottom of this slide. This next slide illustrates the time series of Beaufort Sea's pertinent variations. In black, we have estimates from the data-constrained coupled ocean and sea ice model of the ECHO project used in this study, compared with observations in red and blue. These are anomalies from 1993 to 2017 of quantities averaged within the Beaufort Gyre region, contoured in black in the left panel, where the ECHO's sea level trend exceeds 6 millimeters per year over this period relative to its global mean. As many of you are aware, sea level in the Beaufort Sea has been rising rapidly during the last 2 decades, especially after 2007, shown in the top left, accompanied by an increase in the region's freshwater content, shown in top right. The variations of the ECHO estimate in black are largely consistent with satellite sea level and in situ freshwater content observations analyzed in previous studies. The bottom figures, which also demonstrate consistency between model and data, show sea ice on the left decreasing in the Beaufort Sea also from around 2007, and ocean bottom pressure plotted to its right varying at high frequency, but lacking significant decadal change that's seen in other quantities. Let me go back. The bottom pressure variations, however, explain most of the sea level's high frequency fluctuation, evidenced by the slowly varying steric sea level, shown in blue in the bottom left of this slide, obtained by removing bottom pressure signals from sea level. This blue steric sea level change is almost entirely halosteric, as evidenced by its similarity to the model's freshwater content, plotted in the top right. So Beaufort Sea's ocean bottom pressure reflects a near uniform barotropic oscillation that spans a much larger area of the Arctic as well as the Nordic seas, whose mean is shown in blue in the time series in the bottom right, that's practically identical to Beaufort Sea's change in black. This pan-Arctic variation was the subject of another IARPIC presentation based on the paper at left, and was found to be driven by winds along the continental slope of the Arctic and its neighboring seas away from the Beaufort Sea. Here in this study, we explore the causal mechanisms of these other variations that are unique to Beaufort Sea, especially its interannual to decadal change using the ECHO model. Employing what we call the adjoint gradient decomposition, we expand Beaufort Sea's mean sea level, J, with respect to its forcing, phi, on the right-hand side, as a function of type of forcing, subscript I, like wind and freshwater flux at the surface, the forcing location, R, and time lag, delta T, between sea level and the forcing. This equation is essentially a first-order Taylor series expansion using the model's adjoint to compute the decomposition's gradient coefficients. Importantly, unlike correlation, this equation describes a causal relationship between the quantity of interest, J, on the left-hand side and forcing, phi, on the right-hand side. The left figure at bottom illustrates the skill of this expansion, comparing the left-hand side from the model in black with the sum of terms on the right-hand side in green. Now, the agreement between the two curves also hinges on the physical consistency of the echo estimate. The right figure compares the dominant components of this expansion. The wind part in orange and the freshwater flux from sea ice melt is shown in blue. Wind accounts for most of the intraseasonal and interannual variation of the model's sea level, that's also shown in gray, whereas sea ice melt explains the seasonal change. Significantly, however, both are equally important at decadal timescales, as you can see, especially towards the end. Now, sea ice melt is often ignored in sea level change based on Archimedes' principle. But because sea ice is fresher than seawater, sea ice melt occupies a larger volume than equivalent seawater and causes sea level to rise, as was demonstrated by Nordlinger and Brouwer, shown here. We'll skip the details, but the melt amounts to a sea level rise of about 2.5% of the melting sea ice's draft. That's the height below the sea surface. This is one reason why sea ice melt matters to Beaufort Sea's sea level. But there are two more factors which are important, and we'll get to that shortly. Now, the adjoint decomposition in the previous slide can also tell us where the relative forcings matter and when, which together provide insight into processes at work. For instance, this left panel shows where the forcing matters in terms of the amount of Beaufort Sea's steric sea level variance, explained by wind and sea ice melt at different locations. For wind, and the top figure, the results indicate its contributions mainly reflect increasing lateral Ekman transport of fresh water that's surface intensified. For instance, the dominant contributions from wind are found primarily along the edge of the domain, contoured in black, instead of over the subject region itself, with the largest found along the southern border over the continental slope, where change in wind is the largest. Moreover, these contributions come from winds parallel to this region's boundary instead of across it, with clockwise winds around the domain increasing Beaufort Sea's sea level and opposite winds decreasing it, consistent with Ekman dynamics. In comparison, the sea ice melt contributes mainly over the Beaufort Sea itself, reflecting the effects of direct freshwater input over the region, with additional contributions representing the general pathway of circulation, such as the lateral convergence from neighboring regions associated with the anticyclonic Beaufort gyre and the circulation from the Pacific. The timescale of the two components are also distinct and are shown in the right panel. This is as the measured as the variance of each component explained up to different lags. Whereas contributions from wind, shown in red, only matter up to a few months. Effects of sea ice melt, in blue, have a much longer timescale, lasting years. This timescale difference can be attributed to wind mainly causing a mechanical deformation of the gyre that relaxes in a relatively short amount of time, whereas any addition of fresh water over the domain lasts much longer because of the semi-closed nature of Beaufort Sea's gyre circulation. So anything that's added to the region keeps circulating within the gyre for years, which is the second reason why sea ice melt becomes important for Beaufort Sea's sea level change at long decadal timescales. Finally, we investigate the cause of the increasing sea ice melt by examining the region's budget for sea ice mass and ocean heat content illustrated in this figure. Each figure shows time series of the respective quantity in black, and in different color, the time integral of other terms in the tendency equation, which add up to the corresponding black curve. The gray curves are the same as the black ones, but scaled to show details with the axis on the right. We'd like to draw your attention to the general slope of the curves, the change of slope of the curves, illustrated, for example, by the gray lines fitted to the red sea ice melt in the top figure. This slope change indicates sea ice melt increasing from around 2007, but this increase isn't balanced by decreasing sea ice in black. Instead, the increasing melt is balanced by the increasing amount of ice that's brought into the region by wind, shown in blue. So the melting sea ice behind increasing sea level comes from outside the region, not within, which is the third reason why increasing sea ice melt is contributing to Beaufort Sea's sea level rise. This increase in sea ice melt turns out to be due to increased heating from the ocean, as opposed to the atmosphere or direct radiative forcing, and is reflected in the change of slope of the blue ice ocean heat flux in the ocean's heat budget in the bottom panel. This increased heat that went into melting sea ice, however, also didn't come from changing ocean heat content in black, but by the wind's increased advection of heat into the region in red, and a secondary radiative component in magenta that occurs later. So Beaufort Sea's increasing sea ice melt is primarily due to wind bringing in more sea ice and more heat, and is a wind-driven change, just like the rest of the ocean's response underlying its sea level rise. So in summary, our study suggests Beaufort Sea's sea level is driven by wind and sea ice melt. Sea ice melt dictates seasonal change, and wind dominates other intra-annual and interannual variations, but both contribute equally at decadal timescales. Importantly, the decadal change of sea ice melt is itself primarily wind-driven. Finally, this analysis shows how change in Beaufort Sea's state, like the ocean often is only a small residual of much larger changes in competing processes, and illustrates the importance of resolving those processes to understanding what's happening. And with that, I'll end my talk. Thank you.
Very nice, Ichiro. Thank you very much. This was a very fascinating presentation. I think we have maybe 8 or 7 minutes, 7 or 8 minutes for some clarifying questions from the audience. If anybody has a question for Ichiro, you can also put it in a chat. But if somebody wants to speak up to ask a question, that would be great.
Well, but there are 2 hands raised, 3 okay. Hands raised. I think Michael Steele is the first, but yep.
Thanks. Right. Okay. Yeah, my connection is lasting. So that was a super interesting talk. Thank you. So my question is, I'm a little confused by the stuff at the end. Probably you had to rush it, but the ice is melting because of the atmosphere. Can you explain that a little more? Is it there's warm air advection coming in? I mean, what was that about?
Ice is melting because of the ocean. It's because it's getting heat from the ocean. So what I didn't show is the sea ice heat budget. And so ice is, of course, melting by gaining or losing heat to the atmosphere or the ocean. And if the plot that I haven't shown, which I do have a plot somewhere in this slide of deck of slides, the ice atmosphere heat flux, the same plot, is basically a straight line. Whereas the ice ocean heat flux, there's a bend in the curve. There's a break in the slope. And that is the same shape as this blue curve on the bottom. So the heat that melts the ice is increased heat that's accelerating the sea ice melt is coming from the ocean. Now that heat that comes from the ocean is not really changing the heat content of the ocean that much. As you see here, the black curve is pretty much flat. That extra heat is actually brought in by the wind. That's the red curve, the horizontal convergence of heat from the surrounding. So the wind is bringing in extra ice and extra heat, and it's all melting within the Beaufort Gyre. And because the gyre is closed, it's going to stay there, and it accumulates. Even though the sea level rise by sea ice melt is only 2.5% of the draft, it keeps on accumulating, and over time, over decadal time scales, you begin to see it. That's what we think is happening. At least that's what seems to be happening in the echo analysis.
I see a lot of other raised hands. I see a lot of other raised hands, so I'm going to bow out. But I'm honestly, I'm sorry, I'm a little still confused.
Okay.
So
I'll be happy to come back to that.
Okay.
If you've had time. Yeah.
Wei?
Sorry, my question relates to at the start of your slide, you showed Pan-Arctic versus Beaufort Gyre kind of the difference. And then you said something about the Pan-Arctic is due to the wind around the boundary of the Arctic. And then, so that statement kind of confused me a bit. I wonder,
there's two things, or many things going on. One thing I tried to separate is this barotropic, the deep ocean signal, the high frequency signal, which causes this ocean bottom pressure or sea level a uniform up and down, which was initially found by data by Cecilia Peralta-Fries and her colleagues across the Arctic, deep ocean basins of the Arctic Ocean and the Nordic Seas, illustrated in the left panel. This blue region, although I just colored it, if you look at sea level, it goes up and down uniformly. And that is caused by winds shown in the right panel on the continental slope of the Arctic and the North Atlantic and a little bit of elsewhere. And this is what's happening is coastally trapped waves generated by these winds. And it's an entirely different phenomena from the decadal change that we see in the Arctic Ocean. And so the high frequency part is due to this continental slope winds all around. And what's left is this essentially the blue steric sea level change, this annual and interannual and decadal change. And that is the main subject of this talk, which was due to local winds, Ekman convergence and divergence, and sea ice melt. Does that make sense?
Francesca?
Yeah, if we still have time, I mean, I think my question is along the line. So I was wondering, how can you distinguish the effect of wind and sea ice? Because if you remove wind, as you say, you wouldn't have convergence, so you couldn't say that it's the sea ice melt that is contributing. So yeah, there was my question. And also, I think I was a bit confused by the picture of the sea ice in the glass, because I tried to do that experiment myself. So yeah, but that's
okay.
Probably
okay, yeah, I'll address both questions. What we can separate this because what we do essentially is we just take the ocean model of this coupled model, and when we ran echo, the full coupled model, we save the ocean surface forcing, wind stress, heat flux, and freshwater flux acting on the liquid surface of the ocean. And we just run the ocean model with that. So we can then essentially tell which part is due to wind, which part due to freshwater flux. Freshwater flux does change, as you pointed out, when sea ice moves, but that's taken out already. We've separated that because that sea ice impact on the ice is basically through heat and freshwater exchange. And that's the freshwater and heat flux that we are forcing the ocean. So even if we switch off wind, there's still that effect of freshwater and heat flux that would have happened if the ice were there. But the ocean doesn't know that the ice is not there. It only cares what the flux is. So that's why we how we separate the two effects. Now the other question is this experiment. This experiment, I think, this picture, I think, is brilliant. But they comment on this in this paper. This is extremely salty water to see this effect at this scale. I forgot what the numbers are, but this is not really seawater. This is much saltier water. And if you do this, yes, you can see the effect like that. Sea level will go up. So try putting in more salt in the water part when you next time you do this.
I will try. I still have to figure it out, but I will try.
Great, thank you. Great discussion. I don't see any more hands raised. I thought John had his hands raised. Do you still want to ask a question, John, or are you good? All right, if not, then yeah, you can continue asking questions in the chat also. But for now, let's move over to Francesca Doglioni from the Alfred Wegener Institute. Very pleased to have her here. It's quite late there, probably. She's going to talk about sea level.
Still okay.
Okay, still awake, that's good. Yeah, sea level and geostrophic currents derived from satellite altimetry.
Yeah, so there we go. Maybe just. So first of all, thanks for the invitation. I'm really happy to contribute to this discussion. And what I wanted to present today is bits and pieces from my PhD work, which I thought fit very well with this discussion. And yeah, on the right side, you can see a few of the colleagues that contributed to my research. So what I will focus today, I wanted to focus on 3 points or 3 questions. First, let's see. First, I wanted to give an overview of what's the status of altimetry in the Arctic and what are the challenges that still need to be overcome, especially from my point of view, let's say. So I will present a dataset, a gridded dataset that I have generated during my PhD time, and show some results to explain what kind of temporal and spatial scales we can expect from such a dataset. And finally, I wanted to have a bit of a discussion of whether this kind of data, satellite data, altimetry data, can be used to link local observations, in situ observations, to rather a large-scale variability in surface currents and sea level, yeah, and also to facilitate understanding the forcing of this variability. And so we can start with the first question. And to start, I would like to show you this figure, which shows the actual coverage of the satellite altimetry mission CRISAT-2 over a single month in September 2011. And what this clearly shows is that there is a potential for this kind of data to really fill this somehow this data gap that there is in the Arctic. You can see there is a lot of observation on the shelves in the central Arctic and also under the ice, where actually the satellite can see the sea level in between, like in cracks in the ice, and that's how this is derived. But in my opinion, there are still several challenges to satellite altimetry, and I mentioned here a few, which I think is there are few missions that cover this high latitude, and they are discontinuous. Some, for instance, ISAT-1 stopped before CRISAT-2 or was very short in time, and then the observation in the ice-covered part require dedicated processing. So actually, often, especially for oceanographic purposes, they are not really used. And then this is a very important point that in the Arctic there is very high frequency small scale variability, which actually require higher temporal resolution, so multi-mission products, to really capture this variability. And finally, these are long track data, and for long-term climate studies, as you have seen from Ichiro presentation as well, one needs the gridded data sets, and these are still very few. And for instance, the data set from Armitage has been used so many times. And so in my work, I just tackled a few of these points, and I generated myself a data set of sea level anomaly or sea surface height and geostrophic velocity for the Arctic Ocean. And I've used data from a CRISAT-2 mission, so that up to 88 north, as you've seen in the previous figure. And then I included also ice cover regions, data from ice cover regions were processed by the Alfred Wegener Institute, and I mapped them into monthly maps between 2011 and 2020. And this data set is now under review together with the associated manuscript, and hopefully will be available soon. And this is just an example of one monthly map where you can see the actual sea surface height, let's call it, the dynamic ocean topography, and the associated geostrophic flow. And so this was what I think are still the challenges, as I said, but then still from a data set that is based on a single mission, as the one that I just presented, this saga data set, as I call it. What kind of resolution can we expect? What can we observe from this kind of data? And among the several comparisons that I did to validate this data set, I want to focus here on one validation, which is a comparison of geostrophic velocities to mooring arrays. So to velocity, in situ velocity from two mooring arrays in the Arctic. One is in the Front Strait, and in particular, I will show time series of the West Spitsbergen current, and one is in the Laptevsea continental slope, where I compared velocities in the Arctic boundary current. And what we can see is that the two data sets agree relatively well, and especially they do resolve both a seasonal acceleration in the winter period and deceleration in summer. And then starting from these very local results, can we have a look more at the large scale? What can we see? And so if we look at the geostrophic velocity in the Arctic-wide domain, and here in the specific, I want to focus on a seasonal speed anomaly in the period between October and December. We observed that there is a kind of a large scale acceleration of slope currents, especially in the Eurasian part. Then there are other processes, for instance, in the Beaufort Gyre and also along the coast of Greenland. But what I want to focus is on this kind of large scale pattern on the Eurasian side that it's very evident, and in a way this result is consistent with many mooring inferred results from several papers from previous literature, and here I just put locations where these other studies show an acceleration of currents or water transport, volume transport in early winter time, let's say. And so from this result, we can take that this kind of data can be used to study a boundary current from a large scale perspective, and to integrate several mooring based or in situ based results. And so then we directly go into my third question, which is, can we take advantage of altimetry to understand better the forcing of this large scale variability? And so to do this, I want to start from a very basic concept of sea surface height and geostrophic currents. So what happens is that the horizontal gradients of sea surface height are related to the strength of geostrophic currents. And as this slope increases, then the geostrophic currents accelerate. But then the variability of the sea surface height, it can be related to, as Ichiro was saying, to steric component, which means expansion or contraction of the water column, or to mass variation. And in this case, I will mostly focus on convergence or divergence of water masses. And at this point, my question is, what is the nature of the sea surface height variability that contributes to this variability in the slope currents at the seasonal time scale that I've seen before? And to do this, I used, as I said, the data from our satellite data set, SAGA, and data from a model, the finite element sea ice ocean model, FASOM, which is a model with high skill in the Arctic. And I've used in particular a historical run forced by atmospheric reanalysis from the GRA 55. And first thing first, I looked into seasonal differences of sea surface height. So seasonal differences between early winter period and summer period. And from satellite data, we can see that difference in sea surface height between these two seasons has two main points that I would like to mention. So the largest differences are in the shelf seas, and there is also a divide between the shelf regions and the deep basin, in the sense that the oscillation is in antiphase between these two regions. And so what can we see from the model? We can see a very similar pattern. Actually, they agree quite well. Moreover, I can use this model data to further separate the steric differences, seasonal differences, from the mass seasonal differences. So I will show something similar, but just for the variability in the sea surface height due to temperature and salt change versus mass change. And what happens is, especially if you have a look at the order of magnitude of these changes, you see that the changes in steric height are much weaker and patchy somehow. They are related to very local processes, such as river water plume in this case, and Atlantic water flowing along the shelf, the break, or the Beaufort gyre, as we were hearing from Ichiro. Whereas the mass variability shows a much more consistent large-scale behavior, and also reflects this dipole between the shelf region and the deep regions. So actually being interested in what is the variability that modulate this gradient, the sea surface height horizontal gradient between the shelf and the deep regions, I focused on the mass variability. And so up to this point, we have seen some results, and what is now is rather some questions that are still are still in progress. And one of them is, can the seasonal variability of the ocean mass be explained by Ekman transport across the shelf break? So Ekman exchanges between the deep basin and the shelf. And the second question is, why are these large oscillations so confined to the shelf seas? And so I will give some ideas, and then I hope that these questions can also spark some discussion. So firstly, regarding the question on the Ekman transport, what I did is to compute the Ekman transport across this transect onto the shelf seas, and compare it to the variability to the seasonal cycle in the ocean mass. And so this is how I calculated the Ekman transport, if someone would like some details. And so I looked at the climatologies, of course, I'm always talking about model data of ocean mass, in this case, average of the whole shelf seas box, and the time integrated Ekman transport. And what results is that both these climatologies show a buildup of mass on the shelf in the summer period and early winter. So they are in phase. We can see some relation, but at the same time, we see there is a big difference in the order of magnitude. So this is for sure not the whole story. And this is, as I said, work to be continued. And then regarding the second question, why these seasonal oscillations are confined to the shelf seas. Here, as I said, I was saying to Ichiro that I was happy that he is here because I put another figure from the same paper that he was mentioning actually, where in this study, they applied some anomalous wind forcing along the shelf northeast of Svalbard, and they observed how the ocean bottom pressure, which is the same as ocean mass, basically, how it evolves. So there are two mass anomalies that develop across the shelf, and then they travel along the shelf. Then in this case, the wind forcing stops. So they apply wind forcing for 1 hour, and then the wind forcing stops, and so the two anomalies cancel each other again. But then my question is, what happens if instead this anomalous wind forcing is seasonal, and could it actually, so our seasonality on the shelf, could it be related to similar process? But this is also, I haven't done further, I haven't had further results on this so far. Coming to summarize my talk, the first question was, what's the status of altimetry in the Arctic, and what are the challenges? So from my point of view, especially there is a need of higher temporal resolution, and to have merged observations from open ocean areas and ice covered areas. And then that these data are actually graded for climate studies. And then secondly, we have seen that even with a product used in a single mission, you can resolve seasonal larger timescales, especially you can study boundary currents. And then finally, talking about the boundary current seasonality or sea level seasonality, we see that in the shelf there are seasonal mass oscillations, and that possibly are related to Ekman transport across the shelf break onto the shelf. And yeah, that's it from my side. And please, I'm happy to have a further discussion on this and try to answer questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Francesca. It was extremely interesting presentation and very nicely complementary to what Ichiro showed.
Yeah, I was really happy.
That's perfect. Thank you very much. So I already see a couple of hands up. Of course, Mike is the first one. Mike, go ahead.
Of course. Well, again, another really interesting talk. Thank you. So here's my question. I mean, the science was really interesting, but I want to talk about the data set, just ask a question. So there's the Armitage data set, and there's your data set. And what do I do if, is yours later than his? Like, what do I do if I want like a long time series?
Yeah, so I think in their case, at this point in time, they are carrying on with the reprocessing of data, and they have also extended the time series. But what I think, so also in my paper, I am comparing the two data sets, and they do correlate well over most of the Arctic, but there are some regions where there is lower correlation or there are larger root mean square differences. So what my point is, I think at some point, also this kind of gridded data set will result as a sort of, as if you were thinking of models. You don't use one model because you have so much uncertainty. And so you rather use an ensemble, let's say. And I think everyone is trying, for instance, different corrections and different, and I think that the idea in the end is that each of these data set can offer you something a bit different. Of course, I think at some point there might be one big institution taking over and really opening a team that does this, because otherwise there will always be lots of uncertainty in this kind of products. And I think that we are on the way, but I think we're not there yet. So
okay,
yeah, that's my overall
thank you.
answer. Yeah.
Ichiro?
Yes, hi. Thank you for very interesting analysis and data. I have two questions regarding the data and a comment. Regarding the data, how much data are there actually goes into a monthly map? How close can you get to the coast? And also, is possible aliasing of the kind of barotropic fast motions that was part of my talk? Is that a concern possibly if you don't have enough data? And the one comment I have at the end is regarding the shelf mass. You looked at the Ekman transport. Another possibility might be coastal waves coming in from the North Atlantic, going in and then spilling over into the deeper ocean, but still on the shelf, which will cause a difference between mass on the shelf and in the deep ocean. I wonder whether you've considered that too. So two-part question.
I think I will try to answer one at a time, and then maybe you can repeat the second one. Yeah, so some data get quite close to the coast. I think rather a limitation is in the Canadian and Arctic, like very packed ice, and then you don't have much leads. And so in that region, you rather have scarcer observations. In my case, I also put a coastal mask. So I just excluded data from 10 kilometers from the coast. So, yeah, I couldn't say exactly how close that goes, but then there were data points even closer. And then, as I said, this high frequency variability is really an issue, because if you have seen some raw altimetry maps in the Arctic, they look like very stripy, because there is some like barotropic waves, fast barotropic waves, which are not resolved and cannot be really very well corrected. They're difficult to remove. So the two options are either you really have a very high resolution in time, maybe with using more than one satellite, or you have to find a good, let's say, a model correction, because that's usually what's done in satellite altimetry, that you use a model to. And there is this, one of the corrections that is applied is called dynamic atmosphere correction, which is similar to an inverted barometer, but rather it also contains barotropic waves traveling. But I think in the Arctic, this might be still not a very, yeah, I mean, the model from which this correction derived might not be the best. The region might not be the best region where this acts. So there is definitely an issue about removing high frequency variability from the, if you use data at least from one satellite. Yeah. And then I think your second question or comment was about waves.
Waves from the North Atlantic, for instance, along the coast, which would probably show up in sea level along the coast, but not on the in the deep ocean.
Yeah. So actually, so that where the idea started also from your paper. Okay, in my case, in the case that I showed, I just showed this wind forcing inside the Arctic. But if I remember well, you were saying that a lot of variability is due to wind forcing just like around the Nordic seas or even more south, right? So I still don't capture very well what could be, but my question is rather like these waves that you are talking about are processes, are very fast processes. So what I wonder is whether this can at all have an effect on a seasonal time scale, because that's what I'm looking at, and how in a way. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
At least in the model that we analyzed, the waves that come from the North Atlantic go into the Arctic on the shelf, then spill over into the deep basin. The part that spills over into the deep basin stays for a long time, but the part on the shelf disappears, just propagates through. So you end up with a mass difference between the shelf and the deep ocean, because the deep ocean part signal just stays. So it's not that the signal on the shelf stays, it's a deep ocean, so that signal that stays. So you get this contrast. So I wonder whether you might be seeing some of that effect or not, but I could be wrong.
Did you see whether these waves have a seasonality?
No, we didn't look at seasonality. No, we haven't. So it might be entirely different.
Yeah, what I'm thinking is, of course, if you have this buildup in the, let's say then in the deep basin, if you have more frequent wave in a certain period, in a certain season, that could kind of explain the difference between the two.
Possibly there's seasonality in sea ice cover, so that could modulate perhaps the wind stress, and seasonality is not something that we looked at, so it might be additional things or different things that go on.
It's really difficult to, especially if it's a remote forcing, to identify where it can come from. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I don't see any more hands raised. Anybody still wants to speak up? Maybe early career scientists that are on the call? Any questions that you might have for Francesca or Ichiro? All right, if not, it's 2 minutes before the hour. We can stretch it, or we can just say, well, thank you everybody for joining us, and especially Francesca and Ichiro for presenting, and everybody else for participating in this very interesting discussion. I really enjoyed this session. It was really, really nice. Mike, are you going to stretch it? Maybe you should unmute yourself first.
Yeah, sorry. Well, Francesca, I wanted to ask you more about the science then that you were showing, and I want to ask you about off-shelf transport of fresh water. Did you say something about that?
Not specifically of fresh water. I was meaning rather, so when I separate the steric component to this mass component, meaning that I compute the steric component, and then the residual is basically what I consider as mass component, and this I compared, like the variability of these on the shelf, I compared to Ekman transport, like time integrated Ekman transport, and that's kind of like they are separate calculations in the sense that on the one side, in the model, you have wind blowing on the ocean or on the ice. And then from that, like you can actually compute the stress at the surface and the Ekman transport. That, yeah.
Okay. Maybe we can talk offline. I have some interest in that right now. So
Okay.
maybe I'll send
Okay,
you
sure.
an email or something.
This
Thank
is
you. It was
John.
very-
This
very
is John. So I think if the ice is in free drift, you can just integrate the Ekman equations upwards through water and ice and get the net mass transport. It may be solid, it may be liquid. You don't have to do this partitioning if the ice is in free drift.
I couldn't
Because there's
say
no
that
stress, there's no stress discontinuity at the ice-ocean interface. And so you can vertically integrate all the way up to the top of the ice or the top of the air, doesn't matter. And you can relate wind stress to the mass transport. Right?
But then in the Arctic, there is a lot of pack ice, which cannot really be considered in
Right.
free drift, right? Yeah.
Right.
All right, great. Thanks. Very nice discussion. Meredith, do you want to close it up?
Sure. Thanks everyone for joining. The recording will be posted by next Thursday. So feel free to go to the event page and share that link, which will also be on YouTube. And yeah, again, thanks to our speakers.
Great.
Thank
Thanks
you.
very much, everybody.
Thanks for inviting.
Bye.
Have a good rest of your
Bye.
day. Evening.